Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hall, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. Well, my guest today to kick off Season 3 is Eryn Lynum. She's a master naturalist, Bible teacher, author, and host of the podcast Theo, Nature Lessons Rooted in the Bible. Eryn and I are going to talk about how she went from food blogging to becoming a certified master naturalist, how the podcast started with an idea and zero plan, and how she's grown it into a membership, curriculum, and ministry. So let's jump right in. Here's my conversation with Eryn Lynum. Hey, Eryn, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
Yeah, so I was first introduced to you and your podcast, Theo, by a friend of mine, Garrett Hampton. And so at the end of the episodes, I ask my guests who they think would also be great as guests on the show. And your name came up when I had Garrett on the show. And then just at the end of last season, Mackenzie Smith also brought up your name. And so I'm super glad to have you on the podcast today. And so a little context, you started the podcast, Theo, a little over 2 years ago at the end of March 2023. And the description for the podcast reads in part, join master naturalist, Bible teacher, and author Eryn Lynum as we explore God's wild and wonderful world. God's wild and wonderful world is full of amazing life lessons. As we get outside and adventure through creation, we'll discover how deep and wide the Father's love is for us. Each episode of the Theo, Nature Lessons podcast teaches God's truth through visuals in nature. Nat from natural, Theo from theology, where kids dive into the study of natural theology, discovering God through nature. So I'm glad to have you on the show to hear more about your podcasting journey, Eryn. And we're going to start at the beginning of your content creation journey, which happens to be back in about 2011. I saw on your website that it was established in 2011. So I did some digging and saw that you started as a blogger. Like some of the other folks that I've had on this podcast get started in blogging, maybe write a book, start a podcast. And so your blog was called From Famine to Foodie. And so I'd love for you to tell the story of getting into blogging and then to publishing your first book in 2018.
Yeah, I began blogging when our first son was just a baby, not even a year old. And it kind of went along with my health journey. I have a strange autoimmune disorder, Addison's disease. And so we were overhauling our diet. My husband and I were learning how to cook with whole foods and trying new recipes. And I'm at home with a baby, and our baby napped wonderfully, like 4 or 5 hours in the afternoon. So what do I do with my time? And so I would cook and I would write about it. And that's really where the blog came from. From Famine to Foodie, the name really went back to a history of eating disorders and coming from a place of fear of food to really embracing food as God's gift to us to help fuel our bodies. And so that's really where it all began back in 2011.
Nice. Yeah, so from there, you went on to write the blog for several years, and then you eventually wrote your first book in 2018. Tell us about that journey from being a food blogger to then, okay, I'm going to write this book.
Yeah, so as I was blogging, I began writing more about faith and family as we added another child and then 2 more. So we had 2 kids at the time, and I was in this blogging journey. I began to kind of just bring in more of our journey as parents and what God was teaching me. And so when our second son was 1.5 years old, he was being dedicated at our church, and our pastor gifted us a jar of 936 pennies. And he explained that every penny in that jar represents 1 week that we have with our child between birth and 18. And so it really was this message of intentional parenting based on Psalm 90:12, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And so I wrote about that little penny jar, and what we ended up doing was setting up a second jar because he had challenged us to take out a penny every week. And that was really hard to do. And so we started moving our pennies over to remind ourselves that we're making an investment. We're building into this child's eternity and legacy and their future. And so I wrote a little post about that. And at the time, a handful of people read my blog. It was more just this creative endeavor for myself. But that post ended up going viral. And I think it was after a couple months, it had over 1 million views. And so
Wow.
we're
Yeah.
just like, okay, there's something happening here. This is resonating. And that's when I started to think, maybe there's a book here. And my husband and I began praying about it. I had no training in this. I had no idea how to navigate the publishing world. And so I just began visiting writers' conferences and gathering all the information I could, watching webinars. And I just started writing in faith this manuscript. And long story short, over a couple of years of visiting conferences and eventually landing with an agent, that book was contracted by Bethany House under bigger publishers. And so that's really where the first book came out of, was that viral blog post.
Nice. Yeah. And so then a couple years later, I saw on LinkedIn that you became a certified master naturalist. That was in March of 2020. And so I'm interested to know what took you from, this food blogger to writing a book to then deciding to go become a master naturalist.
Well, after that first book,
Yeah.
I don't know if this is true for every author, but you think, oh, you finally land a book deal, you've made it, and it's just going to be another book and another book. And it's not like that. Publishers have their own timelines. They're looking for specific topics
Sure.
and specific seasons. And so after that first book, it did well. But after that, it was this real struggle of, okay, was that it? Do I keep writing? Do I do another book? I didn't really know what to write on. I'd done this book on intentional parenting, but now what? And at the same time, our family made a big move from the Midwest to Colorado to the Rocky Mountains. And we start spending more time out in creation. And I began to see that God has given us all these materials in nature, and we can use those materials to teach his truth. And my passion has always been theology, and that's what my degree is in biblical studies. And I started to see, okay, if I learn more about all these materials in nature, the creatures and the plants and the ecosystems, then I can use those to teach theology to my own kids, perhaps to others. And so that was really this pursuit of certifying as a naturalist, was to better understand those materials. Going back to natural theology, that's really what science was born from, was this pursuit of the creator, these natural historians, natural philosophers, looking closely at the details of nature to better understand God. And so that was the whole catalyst behind that training.
Nice. Yeah. So at that point, what would you say was your relationship with podcasts?
Basically, there was no relationship with podcasts. My husband has always been an avid podcast listener.
Okay, yeah.
And so my relationship with podcasting was, my husband kept trying to encourage me, you should podcast, you should podcast. That's how people get the word out about the work that they're doing. But I just had no idea what the podcasting world looked like. I had, at that point, been on a couple of podcasts for my first book, but was still at the point where, if I was invited on a podcast, my heart is racing. I printed out all these sheets of notes just in case they asked me a question that I wasn't ready for. And then I'd be digging through, where's the answer? Where's the answer? I was still so uncomfortable with it. And so, when I certified as a naturalist, I was very comfortable in the teaching position because a lot of my volunteer work as a naturalist was teaching.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But I still had basically no familiarity with the podcasting world.
Gotcha. So what took you from, okay, I don't really know much about podcasting, but maybe I should pursue this. My husband's encouraging me to do this. How did you go from that point to, okay, I'm going to buy the equipment and start looking into this podcasting thing?
Well, my husband bought the equipment for me, I think as part of his encouragement to do this. But after certifying as a naturalist, my second book, Rooted in Wonder, was born out of that. And it's all about how we can take our kids outside and reconnect the dots between creation and creator, returning nature study to its proper place as theology. And so we're revving up for this book launch, and my husband buys me a decent mic for interviews, because at this point, I'm more familiar, more comfortable with being on a podcast. So he gets me a decent mic. And then as we're leading up to the launch of that book, I'm in busy book launch mode. And suddenly, I just get this little idea in my mind, I believe it was from the Lord, of what Jesus's favorite bird might have been. And so I write out a little script, and it ends up being a nature lesson for kids. And so did not plan on podcasting for children, but I record this little 10-minute lesson. No idea what I'm doing, by the way. My mic is 3 feet above my head because I didn't know where to place it. So that first, it's still live on my website, but it's this echo because I had no idea. But I figure out that night how to get it onto a hosting platform and how to set it out live. And so I put it out into the world. And lo and behold, people start listening.
Mm.
And so I put out a second episode and I put out a third episode. But that's really where it began. I had no idea what I was doing and I had zero plan.
That's nuts. So you went from, I have this idea for something and you wrote it out and then you recorded it and decided, okay, well, we'll just figure this out. I'll just publish it. I mean, it really isn't too terribly hard to figure out how to publish an episode on a hosting platform and do it. But you took all the time, you did it. And then you started publishing episodes consistently and, writing those episodes, doing the recording, the editing, the publishing of the episodes. What did that process become as you went from, I had this idea to now I'm going to start doing this regularly? What did that workflow kind of look like for you?
God made it very clear very early on that this was my main ministry. Now, when we started to see how families were responding to this whole concept, and the listenership, like at first we had no idea what we were looking at when we would look at the analytics. I'm like, oh, look, there's a couple hundred people listening. That's great. And then as it started building, we start like, oh, what does this actually mean? And we start looking at the numbers and we're like, oh my goodness, like we have something here. People are really resonating with this. And so God just laid it on my heart, like this is your main ministry. And so it was very natural that we went into a regular rhythm. At first, every other week, that was just all I could manage. At the same time, I've owned a marketing business for over a decade now.
Nice.
And so I was doing like some marketing on the side for a company. And that work was so purposeful. It was a Christian company and it was exactly what our family needed for the 5 years I worked with them. And it was so purposeful, but I just felt the Lord nudging me more and more toward the podcast and the ministry that was building there. And so in faith, I began to step out of the marketing work, trusting that God would make up for it through the podcast somehow. Like this was this massive step of faith, but that was really how he led me into the consistency of it.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I'm intrigued. You were doing the marketing stuff. You were starting to phase out of that, leaning more into the podcast. How did that experience that you had before in marketing help with the podcast as you were getting that going? Because you've been creating this other content for somebody else and now you're being able to focus on your own content. What did that look like?
Yeah, I can definitely see how a lot of the training in marketing has lent into this. Just knowing, you have to do it excellently. You need to focus on quality. You need to have a consistent brand, a consistent voice, and know who you're speaking to and what their felt need is. And so in this case, a big felt need is these families, these parents who are desiring truth for their kids. And they value real science and they value nature study, but they want it from a biblical worldview without all of these lies intertwined throughout it. They want something that they feel safe pressing play on, knowing that their child is learning about the wonders of creation while their faith is being nurtured. And so it was really sweet to just see how God brought together like this deep sense of purpose, this exciting work, and then even utilizing the experiences he had given me to learn the marketing behind it and all of that coming together to just bring truth to more homes.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, so I looked back at the nearly 100 episodes that you've put out so far, and I noticed that most of the episodes are solo episodes with you teaching on a specific topic, and then sprinkled throughout, there's some interviews here and there. So how did you land on that solo teaching format, which I think is actually, at least in my practice, has been a lot harder than doing interviews? So what made you land on that format?
I wouldn't even say I landed there. I began there. Again, there was really no strategy from the get-go. In my background, I had done a lot of teaching in my work as a naturalist and then with guiding hikes. And so that's kind of just what I began with. And then I want to say it was about a year and a half in, I wanted to start bringing more voices into the podcast who could speak to things that I am not an expert in. And it started with, we were doing a series on ocean animals. And so I had taught a lot about the creatures I'm familiar with here in the Rocky Mountains. I was like, who am I to talk on jellyfish and sharks? Like I can do the research and I do the research. Like I have taught on creatures that I've not personally encountered. But another reason was I wanted to show children, like one of our core values for Nat Theo is inspiring curiosity, this God-given curiosity in the children. And a way I wanted to do that was to show them like, it's not just me And it's not just a select few people. Like your interest in nature, God can grow that into a purposeful career. You don't have to give up this interest in insects or rocks or whatever it might be. Like God can grow that into something big. And so as they see these other scientists and wildlife biologists and all these people coming onto the podcast, they are more encouraged that this is a worthwhile pursuit that they don't need to give up. If someone says, oh, you're strange, you like going out and finding insects or whatever, they can say like, no, like people do this in real life for their real job. And so just to give them more voices speaking into that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, that's actually a similar way in which I got into podcasting, in that I listened to this radio show called Adventures in Odyssey. They started a podcast in which they talked about the jobs that are behind the scenes. And I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. You can make Adventures in Odyssey by becoming a sound designer. And so that's what got me into audio production. So it's cool to hear hearing those other voices and knowing that, oh, this could be a job if that's something that I'm really interested in doing is super impactful. That was impactful to me at 10 years old and just brought me to here today. So that's really cool. That's really impactful. So I'd love to hear too. So you talked about how you started going kind of on a whim, and then you started publishing podcasts every other week or bi-weekly. And then I saw, as I was scrolling through the feed, that around October, I think it was, in 2024, you decided to increase the frequency and take it weekly. What was behind that? Okay, let's invest further into the podcast and put out twice as many episodes.
It was a few different things coming together. And first was the demand. Something I never anticipated was that families began using this as their science curriculum.
Okay.
And I'm a homeschool parent. My husband and I grew up homeschooled, and we now homeschool our kids. And so I thought, okay, if they're going to do that, well, we should probably give them a lesson every week that they could dig into. So that was kind of the first thought. And then the second thought was, I don't have the time to do an episode every week. At that point, I was putting in 18 to 20 hours each episode. And so I just didn't have that kind of time because I was still doing the marketing work. Mm-hmm. And so we just began praying about it. Like, is this what we're supposed to do? And very much felt yes. And so that is going back to phasing out of the marketing work. Yeah. I said, okay, Lord, if I'm going to give up that secure income that at the time was very important for our family, like you're going to have to step in and do something here. And so that's when we decided to go weekly. And it was a lot of prep to just get to that point. Sure. Because, there's a lot of different elements of, we were doing everything at that point, the research, the writing, the recording, the editing. At that point, we had already started the full curriculum on the side. And it was so sweet because I think it was the same week that I let this company know, hey, like this has been incredible, but the Lord is calling me to step into my own work. That same week, we brought on 2 new sponsors for the podcast that almost to the dollar replaced that income. It was actually a little over. And That's it was great. The Lord just like, yeah, I'm going to take care of it. Like that was the confirmation to move to weekly episodes.
Nice. That's really cool. So were you in conversations with them before, or did that kind of come out of nowhere to materialize into those sponsorship deals?
We had been working towards sponsorship for a few months, and we had one sponsor at the time, and it was like our first sponsor part-time. Yeah. So we were kind of just dipping our toes into it.
Sure.
And then when I decided to go weekly, that's when we started, okay, we need to rev up the sponsorship and like really make this a thing. And yeah, I think it was that same week that we had 2 sponsors say, yep, we want to hop on.
That's great. That's great. So for listeners that are thinking about starting a ministry podcast and hearing you talk about sponsorships, what did it take to, you said it was a couple month process of even getting to that point of having them sign on. What does that kind of look like for you as you've added sponsors to the show so that other ministry leaders can know, okay, this is maybe what to expect?
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned Garrett, mentioned my name. Theo, he and Yvette were just amazing in helping me navigate this because I saw that they had sponsors. And so I asked him, like, can you just give me some tips? And he hopped on a phone call. It was over an hour long. He gave his time to just walk me through their journey and what they had done. Yeah. And one thing he said is just, this is relationship. And that's so true. Like just knowing that this is not just like, oh, yep, sign it, be done. This is a relationship with your sponsors. And you want to make sure that you're benefiting them. And you want to make sure that what they're offering is benefiting your listeners. And so we've always been extremely prayerful over our sponsorships and very careful to make sure that it's a good match for our listeners. And so, it is just going slowly and nurturing those relationships. Some of it was meeting these companies at conferences before I reached out and followed up. Like, hey, I met you at a conference and I'm going to just start that relationship and then following up. So it can be several months or even longer before they decide to hop on. And at one point, we overstepped and I had too much sponsorship on the episodes. And I had them in such a way that they were breaking up the lesson content. And we received a few mediocre reviews during that time. And that's when I knew, okay, this is too much. Let us back up, reevaluate. And so really paying attention to how it's affecting your episodes. In our case, like I don't have one anymore in the middle of a lesson. They're in a very natural place at the beginning of the episode and then after the lesson before we go into the outro. And so it's really just paying attention to those little things, making sure that it's not negatively affecting the content. And that another core value of ours is making sure that we give our sponsors more than we even say we're going to. And so giving them all of the exposure that we can and making it a very valuable relationship for them.
Yeah, that's great insight as people are thinking about starting a podcast or they already have their podcast but are trying to think about, okay, what does it take to add sponsors? That's great behind the scenes information to get people interested or take them to the next step. So I'd love to know, you said you started off with some podcast equipment, and then I saw that in an Instagram post that you, about a year and a half in, decided to upgrade the equipment. So I'd love to hear too, what made you decide, okay, now is time to get a new mic, upgrade the equipment? What was the impetus for that?
As I mentioned, when I started, I had no idea. I have no background in audio or anything like that. And so it was something I kind of obsessed over for a while. Probably the first 6 months, I would tweak and tweak and tweak. And eventually I got to the point where I was like, okay, this mic is just not serving us anymore as it should. And so that was the impetus of upgrading the equipment, was realizing we've done all we can with our editing software. Now I think it's the mic that's the problem. And so that was around the same time that we took on those sponsors and had the revenue to be able to upgrade some of the equipment. Nothing fancy, just, enough to make sure that the audio is really clear. And I don't know, I really pay attention to the audio quality of a podcast. And that's something that I encourage other podcasters. And my husband first encouraged it in me because he listens to so many podcasts throughout the day that he said he will turn them off if the audio is scratchy or hard to listen to. And so that's just something, I think it's biblical to work toward excellence. And that's a core value of ours, to really focus on the quality of content, the quality of audio. And so whatever we can do to make that listener experience better, then that's something we want to invest in.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. In quality, it just increases that relatability, the relationship that you're talking about with the sponsors. Same thing happens with the listeners. That quality is what's helping translate your voice to them and make it as transparent as possible so they're not even thinking about, oh, that sounded weird, or why did it make that sound, or what's happening there. So that's huge. I want to dive into another piece of podcasting that a lot of people don't necessarily think about until you're starting a podcast, or you just think about at the beginning, and that is cover art. So there's two different types of cover art that people frequently do. You have the podcast cover art, which is what people see when they tap on the show as a whole. And then you can also now, not too long ago, they added this more mainstream, that you can put album artwork for each individual episode, and you do that. And so because you're talking about different creatures in nature, different animals, you frequently are putting images of those along with the title on that artwork. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the decision to invest in making those every week, because that does, I'm sure, take a decent amount of time to do, but I'm sure it's also really effective. It's really glanceable. So tell me a little bit about the decision to do that.
So it goes back to even before I certified as a naturalist. And it was kind of as I was going into that work in my second book, I invested in having someone create a brand and website. And so I've used those elements to really build everything that I do now. And that was several years ago. And I still use those elements every single day. I highly recommend investing when you can in a solid brand where you have the colors, the textures, the fonts, everything you need. And then as I started doing the podcast, the first episodes, the cover art was just text. And it gave you the option to upload the episode cover art. So I was like, if it gives me the option, then I'm going to do it. And then pretty quickly, we started adding the creature or the plants, like you said, to make it very glanceable, that as they're scrolling through, it's really easy to find what they're looking for. And then when we launched our curriculum for our club members, every week they get a lesson guide and it has that creature on it. So it's all just part of the branding. And now it's such a system that it's very easy to create those. Those just take me a couple minutes. And people ask me, I am not at home like with a paintbrush watercoloring those creatures. I'm not a visual artist at all. That's all Canva. I just find the graphics that fit well to what we're teaching. And then I put it together with our fonts and our colors and our backgrounds and things like that. So utilizing my brand and then finding graphics that go along with it.
That's great. Yeah. Having a good foundation with the branding and then just grabbing the things that make sense to put in there. That's great. That's interesting that it's really as quick as that to put it together. That's encouraging. If that's something you want to pursue, it doesn't take a whole lot, but having that brand in place, like Eryn's saying, would be super beneficial to make that a simple process to add those in each week with each episode. You just mentioned the club. And so I noticed that at some point the podcast was going along and then you decided to add the club. How has that relationship developed and what did that look like at the beginning as you were thinking about, okay, maybe we should do something alongside that like is a side-by-side thing for people that are wanting to dive in deeper?
Well, this was another natural outcome of seeing that people were using it as curriculum.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, if they're already using it as curriculum, why don't we give them more resources for every episode? And when I started the club, just like the podcast, I had no idea what I was doing. And it was kind of terrible at first. It was hosted on Patreon, which nothing against Patreon, but it wasn't a great platform for people to be able to find and access the files. It just was very clunky. And so there wasn't a lot of interest at first, and there was a lot of cancellations. I was putting a ton of work into the resources, and I almost quit it. Like, I was like, this is just like ruining my joy for the podcast. And so that was a huge struggle. But several people around me, my husband, and then I'm a part of a Christian business group, and all the ladies in there were like, no, keep going. This is good. This is good. And so I kept going. And then what I did was I started tweaking. Whenever I received feedback, I would take that to heart. So when people said, we're not really enjoying these activities, we'd like to see more of this, more outdoor prompts, more watercoloring. And then when people would drop off because they couldn't access the files, then we made a switch from Patreon to using member space and building everything into my own website. And that created a lot of trust because if people weren't familiar with Patreon, they were very hesitant to jump in because it wasn't on my website. And so once I brought everything in-house on the website, that changed everything with the club. And then I was able to hire someone to help with the science pages. We have an in-house biologist now, and she's helping me with the science curriculum. And then I hired another lady to help with the activity pages who does them way better than I ever could. And so just, again, going back to excellence and quality, these were things that I just wanted to be focused on the research and the writing and the recording, and I do enjoy the editing. And so like handing off other things to people who can do them better. To at this point, I write the script, I send it to them, they do their parts, and then I come back and add the Bible study and then look over everything they've done and do the final edits. And so it's all been tweaking. And at this point, the membership, it is so fulfilling and so exciting. This past weekend, I did a big conference and so many club members and so many listeners came up and just tell me like how they're interacting with it, how much they're enjoying it, the parents seeing their kids diving into the content. And so it was totally worth it to stick it out and just adjust. And again, focusing on excellence and quality all along the way to build that club to where now it is a major part of the work that we're doing.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit more. So as a major part of the work that you're doing, obviously it's a lot of the work that's going into it, sounds like, as well as there's the financial piece of that. How has that been able to help support the podcast?
It's been huge. Like that's what allowed me to be able to hire the people on our team at this point and to find the right people for those positions. And so the club membership actually covers them plus some. And so I would say now like sponsorship and club membership are equal contributors to the revenue of the podcast. And it just keeps growing because we've also grown the club and added extra elements to where every week club members receive the activity guide, but they also get a bonus video and a nature devotion and summer scavenger hunts. And so it's just as we can, as the club is growing, that allows me to be able to hire people, which is really fun to be able just to bring them into the joy of this work. And it just keeps building off of itself.
That's cool. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the workflow. So we were just talking about the club. There's a lot of pieces that go into that. And that all stems out of the original idea for the episode that then gets written and recorded. Walk us through, what does it take to go from, hey, this should be, the next several episodes that we're going to work on, all the way through those getting published?
I love this part, the workflow, because it's been such a refining process.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I have this, I call it the master spreadsheet, and it has every episode. And then every episode has on this spreadsheet, I think it's 20 columns. And each column is a task that either it's me or it's our biologist, Jill, or it's Sarah working on the activity sheets. And so it starts with the idea. And sometimes the idea is something I'm just really interested in. Like, I desperately wanted to research octopuses. And so we did 2 episodes on octopuses.
Nice. Yeah.
Other times it's an idea from a listener. We receive emails every week with listeners, hey, can you do an episode on this or this? And now listeners can actually call in and leave a voicemail. And then we play their voice on the podcast.
Nice. Yeah.
That was actually a really good way to increase listener retention through the episode.
Right.
Because at the end, we have a listener question segment, and kids listen through to hear if it's their question or hear other kids' curiosity. And so it starts with that idea. And then it starts with me researching and writing the script. Depending on if it's something I'm familiar with or something I'm not familiar with, that can take 3 hours, that can take 6 hours. I just did an episode on eels, and the scientific story of eels goes back to Aristotle. It was over 2,000 years trying to figure out where these things even reproduce or if they could reproduce. So it's such a complex story that one took me a few months of research.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm working on other episodes in the meantime, but always going back to these eels to try and work on that one. So it's the research and the writing of the script. And now I have a template for the script because we have a natural flow for the script. The intro, our pre-roll sponsors, our trail map, which tells the kids, hey, here's what we're going to learn about today, our trivia question, and then we go into 4 to 5 points for that lesson. And the 5th point is always the spiritual application. So they're learning all the science, and then we're tying it back to scripture. And then we do the listener question segment and answer the trivia question, and then challenge them, hey, now it's your turn to go explore, and give them something to do that week. And so now that it's a template, it's quicker to write the scripts. After I write them, they go to our biologist and our activity curriculum writer for them to work on their pages. They write those, send it back to me. So I finish up the curriculum. In the same time, I'm recording the episode, and then I do all the editing. And we do YouTube as well for, a lot of families put it up on the screen during science class. And so we do full visuals on YouTube. And so they're working on the curriculum. I'm working on post-production. I finish the curriculum, get everything updated on the website the week before an episode goes live. And that's kind of the whole process.
Yeah. Nice. So how long does that process roughly take from the idea all the way through publishing the episode?
Time commitment, I put in probably about 12 to 15 hours now on an episode. Less if it's something I'm really familiar with. So if I need an easy lesson, I'll choose something I'm very familiar with. But we are now working, I think we're about 5 weeks out in our production right now.
Nice.
And that changes. I'll work to get ahead, if I'm heading out of town. So I have a busy conference schedule coming up. So we're working ahead on those episodes. And then we'll kind of catch back up to where we're 2 weeks ahead. And so we'll work to get ahead again.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so what are some ways that as you've gone to conferences or you've been on other podcasts, you've written other books since then as well, what are some other ways that you've been able to grow the podcast audience?
I would say that email list is really big. And one way we've grown that is, this was key. I had no idea how key this would be when I started doing this. But when we started the club, part of the curriculum every week is a coloring sheet. And it's actually like a 17-page activity guide they get every week. But one part of that is a coloring sheet. And I just decided, why don't we just give the coloring sheet to everyone? And so every weekly lesson has a free coloring sheet available in the show notes. And they have to opt in to my email list to get that. And so I get new email subscribers every single day from these coloring sheets. And then those people become faithful listeners and subscribers, and a lot of them become club members. And so that's just a natural way that I've built the email list, which then just builds the podcast listenership. But yeah, another big way has been conferences, doing booths, but whenever you can, speaking. And, just sharing your message, sharing your heart, sharing your passion up there on stage. For me, a big one is homeschool conferences. That's one we did this past weekend. And you're just growing, basically the conferences, they're gathering all the people for you. So you go speak to them. And the same with guesting on other podcasts. They have gathered the listenership. So go and share your message instead of trying to gather everyone yourself, which is crazy hard, like on social media and everything's so loud there. Take advantage of the audiences that other people have grown by offering them value and asking to guest. And when you do that, have a professional one sheet. I mean, professional, I say, I just made mine in Canva, but make it super easy for them. Like, hey, I would love to share on your show. Here's what I have to offer. And just getting a lot of exposure that way.
Nice. Yeah. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about how the books that you've written have played into the podcast and kind of woven back and forth. So your latest book is called The Nature of Rest. And so I'd love to know, how has the podcast helped contribute to that book?
Oh my goodness, this has been huge. So podcasting is my main work now, and it's my passion. But then I have this extreme passion. Like, I love writing books and getting to share through that avenue. And when you start as an author, it is hard. Like, for one, just getting a book deal, or if you decide to self-publish, you're still, either way, like, you are in charge of the marketing. Podcasting is a major way to share your message. And so having the podcast has been huge for launching this book, because not only am I able to promote the book to all of our listeners, but because I was already podcasting, my husband and I decided, why don't we start a second show? And so we did a special 7-week podcast called The Nature of Rest. And it was him and me. We actually recorded while we were driving. We just had lapel mics. 2 episodes we did while we were driving in Alaska. And so it's super fun because we're discussing the different elements of rest and Sabbath and Selah pauses, everything in the book. But you also get his perspective as a man and a business owner and a dad. And we're like talking about it, and then we're like, oh, there's doll sheep, or like, look, oh, there's a moose on the hillside. Like, there's really fun elements to it.
Yeah.
And so, just having that foundation of, okay, well, we know how to podcast, so why don't we just reach a whole new audience for the launch of this book? Yeah, it's been a really fun and successful launch. And that foundation of podcasting has helped immensely.
Nice. Yeah. So what are some other opportunities that you've had because you've started a podcast and now that's what you're focusing on full time?
So The Nature of Rest just released a couple months ago.
Right. Yeah.
I have 2 more books releasing next year.
Okay.
And it's because of the podcast platform. Because for one, I approached a publisher and I was able to show them the numbers on the podcast and how many families are listening. And so it was pretty much an easy yes for them. They're like, oh, she can get it to all these families. And then very unexpectedly, a large publisher approached me because they saw what was happening with the podcast. And so like just having that, like publishers are, yes, especially Christian publishers, like they are passionate about getting truth to this generation, to families.
Yeah.
They're also a business, and they need to know that their investment is going to pay off and that you can market your book, because they're going to do what they can, but they can only do so much. And so they're able to see with a podcast, like, okay, well, this person has gone through the work of gathering people and growing their platform. We're willing to make this investment in them. And so it's actually led to 2 books majorly because of the podcast.
That's really cool. Yeah. So as we wrap up the interview, I'd love to know, you've kind of woven this throughout, but how has the podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
It's so interesting because I think the podcast actually showed me what my ministry was in a way.
Yeah.
Like God used it. He just had these little promptings to start going. And then before I even knew it, I was doing the most fulfilling, purposeful work I've ever done outside my home, apart from my marriage and raising my kids. Like, I've never felt this much purpose in my work, knowing that truth is going out to so many families. Yeah. And one of our core values is rightly handling the word of truth from 2 Timothy 2:15 and rightly handling science and getting just the joy of doing that. And then I get to be a lifelong learner. My favorite part of this personally is the research and getting to constantly be learning about God's creation. I am in awe. And then I get to share that awe with so many. And so, yes, the podcast has helped to amplify the message, but really it showed me the work that God created me to do.
That's cool. That's really cool. All right, well, let's jump into the high pass segment now, where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So, first question, what's one of your favorite animals?
Oh, it changes all the time, depending on what I'm researching.
Sure.
But one that has definitely stayed with me is the octopus, because a child had asked for an episode on an octopus, and that was one that I was like, I don't know anything about octopuses. And so I started researching, and I was just in awe. Like, these things are called the aliens of the sea because they're so strange, and they have 9 brains. Like, any creature that just has 9 brains and no bones, and you're like, what is this thing? And so that was one that it just created so much intrigue, so much awe. Like, what? Yeah. So that's one that I just so enjoyed researching. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, we'll link to those 2. I think you said there was 2 episodes on octopus.
Yes.
We'll link to those in the show notes if you want to learn more. All right, what's one of your favorite outdoor summer activities to do in Northern Colorado?
I just love hiking. I guide a homeschool hiking group, and it's been such a joy to just take the families out on the trail. But then I also enjoy just hiking with my own family. And that's the hard thing about this work, is that sometimes hiking can feel like work, and that's fine. I love my work, but I also just love going out and losing sense of time, having no agenda, stopping to see whatever's interesting. And so, just getting way out into the wilderness is my favorite, where we can see moose and bear and bighorn sheep and just find all the wildflowers and just reawakening that sense of awe.
Nice. Yeah. All right. Well, what's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how Nat Theo has impacted their life?
There are so many. One, I'm gonna talk recent. So at the conference this past weekend, we had sponsored some of the children's events that were going on, and that meant we got to go to those events. And as the families were dropping off their children, we got to hand out flyers, say, hey, come to our booth. We had live axolotls at our booth, so that was a really big draw for the kids. So I'm handing out flyers and introducing myself to people. And I handed a lady a flyer, and then I kept going. And a minute later, she comes like running through the line, and she's like, Eryn, are you Eryn? I was like, yeah, I'm Eryn. She starts crying right there in the line. And she says, you have no idea how your podcast has changed my life. Wow. And she said that, like, this is a podcast for kids, but families often listen together. And she said, there's so many days that I am so discouraged, and yet we turn on your podcast and it's exactly what I needed to hear. And I'm like, to hear that it's impacting parents and families like that. And then one more, we had a review come in this week on the podcast, and it was from an 8-year-old girl. And she just said, I love your podcast. It's amazing. I'm 8 years old and I have leukemia. And it makes me so happy when I listen. And I'm just like, thank you, Lord. Like, if I can just add joy to a little girl going through a crazy, difficult thing I cannot even fathom, like, what a gift. What a blessing.
Wow. Yeah, those are great. Those are great stories. All right. Well, Eryn, as we close today's episode, who else do you know that would be a great guest for this podcast?
I definitely recommend Hannah Peru from the Upright Christian Parenting Podcast. Her ministry is called Treehouse Storyteller, and she's just a joy. She's here in Colorado. I got to see her again at the conference this past weekend, but she is all about fighting cultural lies. And so she does that beautifully through children's books and through her podcast. But she is devoted to truth, and she's another person who's just devoted to excellence. Like, her work is gorgeous, and she pays attention to all the details. She's an artist. She's an author. Nice. So definitely I would reach out to her.
That's great. Well, thank you for that recommendation. And Eryn, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for such a fun conversation.
It was a lot of fun to talk with Eryn about her podcasting journey and how that prompting from the Lord led her to record the first episode with zero plan that's now become a weekly podcast in thriving ministry. You can listen to Nat Theo with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to support this show, and together we'll help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Ruth Cho Simons. She's a best-selling and award-winning author of several books and Bible studies, an artist, speaker, the founder of Grace Laced, and the host of the Ruth Cho Simons podcast. We're going to talk about how she started her ministry, Grace Laced, why adding video to the podcast was the right next step for the show, and the branding decisions that led to renaming the podcast at the beginning of the year. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.